All right, well, welcome to one and all to the Mary Heiken Dumont University here at the Anshe Svar Beth Lemeth congregation. The Dumont University has been going on for a number of years, and we are very proud to call it by the name of Mary Dumont, who was not only a neighbor, but also a great supporter of the congregation of adult education, and is also a wonderful grandmother and mother as well. So he's a Baruch man memory, continue to be a blessing. We have tonight the privilege of hearing from Rabbi Yitzchak Etshalom. He's been at EULA at YU Los Angeles for many years now. He is master educator in the high school there. They have a special master's program for Tanakh, and he has written a number of books and many articles as well. Has the book on Amos come out yet?
No, it's sitting in Koren, waiting to get going.
So maybe one day Rabbi will grace us with a lecture about Amos.
It's very big.
But he's part of a wonderful series of Tanakh, and because Rabbi Etshalom is recognized, really one of the premier teachers of Tanakh, and he has many recordings you can listen to learn more from him. But we're so privileged that he's joining us to tell us about the journeys of Elijah from the Galilee to Tiberias. Thank you so much, Rabbi Etshalom, joining us tonight. And we look forward to the next 3 weeks.
What years are this? Do you know what year in history this is?
What year in history what is?
That Elijah was around.
Yeah, roughly 850-ish, middle of 9th century BCE.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. And that's going to play a role. We're going to talk about the geopolitical situation and the monarchy situation because they all play a role in understanding Eliyahu. I'm going to ask you all this question. I'm going to ask you to go off mute and give me an answer, and then we'll go back to mute. Why are you here? What do you want to know about Eliyahu that drove you to join this shir? I mean, I'm very happy you're here.
Well, I've heard so much talk about him, and after Havdalah, we sing Eliyahu HaNavi. I learned that like when I was in the first grade.
Right.
And he was obviously one of the most important people that ever lived. So,
or he was a successful songwriter who wrote a good song about himself.
Right. Yeah. So, why not? I mean, it's nobody's ever talked about his life before that in my short years on this earth.
Okay. Anybody else? What are you looking for in this series or tonight?
I wasn't really looking for anything in particular, but the fact that you were offering the class and Rabbi Finkelstein organized it was really okay. Whatever you teach is fine. Thank you.
That's a great testimony to you, Rabbi Finkelstein. That's very good. Okay. Good. Does anybody have anything Eliyahu specific that you're looking at? Because I want to kind of put it in the hopper and make sure that we address it if possible.
Where is this found in English, or I can't translate what's on there. I can't even print it.
Right. So I
is it found on Safaria?
You can find it on Safari. I'll tell you where everything is. This document, which I sent out, has the original, and actually Safaria uses the modern JPS, the new JPS translation, which is very good. So I have that here chapter by chapter, but you won't be able to see them both on the screen. I was hoping everybody would have their own text available. So if you want to open up a Tanakh at home to the book of Kings, chapter 16, then we can take a look together, and we'll go from there. So let me give you some background. I'm going to start the background from the wrong end, because background should start early. I'm going to start late. Charlie mentioned the song Eliyahu HaNavi. We're all familiar with Eliyahu HaNavi's presence at 3 esteemed circumstances. When does Eliyahu show up in our lives?
Pesach.
Right. Is that the Seder? What else?
Bris.
Is that every bris? Good. And Havdalah. You notice, by the way, we do not invite him into the sukkah. You notice that? He's not one of the ushpizin, but he is at every bris. He's at every Seder, and he's there Saturday night. We got to figure out why. And that, of course, is a much later development. Eliyahu showing up at the Seder, Eliyahu showing up at the bris, Eliyahu on Saturday night, is found nowhere before the 10th or 11th century. So it developed because the Jewish people felt a certain way about Eliyahu and made certain associations. So we've got to figure out where that comes from. So now we can roll back to the beginning. What we're going to do is as follows. Tonight, we're going to look, and it's going to be somewhat cursory, but we're going to look at the first 3 chapters of the Eliyahu story in Tanakh, in the Bible. And the chapter you see in front of you, chapter 16, the end of chapter 16, is not part of it, but it's a necessary preface to set the groundwork, to set the stage for what's happening in his life. Next week, we're going to look at the other 3 chapters in Tanakh about Eliyahu. And you'll see a dramatic change between who he is tonight and who he is next week. And in the 3rd session, we're going to look at Eliyahu through the eyes of the rabbis in the Midrash and the Gemara, and see what happens to this character Eliyahu, which is occasioned by the last thing we'll see next week. And so we're going to get a broader view. And by the end of that 3rd week, I'm hoping that we can come back and address the questions of Havdalah, Bris, Pesach Seder. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Now, a little bit of a preface before the preface. I think hopefully everybody here is familiar with the idea that David, was the king over all of the tribes of the Jewish people, all 12, 13 tribes, however many there are. And David was the king over all of them, and ultimately reigning from the city of Jerusalem. David's son, Shlomo, Solomon, continued that, and he also reigned over the entire Jewish people. And by the way, the Davids established a kingdom that stretched all the way to the Euphrates River up in Iraq. And so the promises that we saw given to Abraham a couple of weeks ago were actually realized in David's time. Shlomo took over for him, and Shlomo famously built the Beit HaMikdash, and Jerusalem became not only the political center, but also the religious center for all the Jewish people. And it has remained so ever since, but not exactly. And this is where things change. Shlomo evidently was not as loyal to God as his father was. And as a result of that, God decided to wrest away from him, or from his children, most of the Jewish people. And what we hear about in the book of Kings in chapter 11 is that a prophet found a member of the tribe of Ephraim by the name of Yeravam, and found him out in a field, and took a garment, ripped it into 12 pieces, and gave him 10 of the pieces. And he said, God is giving you 10 of the tribes. Not forever, but if you're loyal to God, this will be a successful kingdom. And a little while later, there's a tax rebellion, essentially, against the new king, Rechavam, Shlomo's son, up in the city of Shechem, in the north. And all the tribes, except for Rechavam's own tribe, which is Yehudah, and Binyamin, who's like a very small tribe that's connected to them, they secede. It really looks like 1861. They secede from the Union. They separate. They say, we don't want no part of you. And they find this fellow Yeravam, and they announce that he's their king. And so far, that's fine, except Yeravam then reasonably comes up with a scenario that he's afraid of. And that is, let's think about it. All the Jewish people living here, it's going to come Sukkot. And where are they going to go on Sukkot? They're going to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the holiday. They're going to come to Jerusalem, and Rechavam, the king, who's the grandson of David, is going to keep them there. He's going to convince them to rejoin him. They're going to come and kill me, and that'll be the end of my northern kingdom. What should I do? So he took advice, and he ended up building an alternate off-site temple, not one, but 2. One at the southern border of his territory in Beit El, and one at the northern border of his territory in Dan, all the way up near Lebanon. And he set up, believe it or not, a golden calf at each place. And he said the same thing that Bnei Israel said at the Egel. This is your God who took you out of Egypt.
Whoa.
You don't have to go to Jerusalem. You could come here and worship. Why go far? You got it right here. And as a result of that, that was really the breaking point where the northern kingdom that we call Yisrael or Ephraim, because Yeravam was from the tribe of Ephraim, broke away formally and completely from Yehuda, or the southern kingdom. And the rest of the history from around the year 940 BCE until 722, for the next 200 years, that history is a history of two separate kingdoms. If you read through the book of Kings, you'll find there's a story about the king in the north, and then he dies and he has another king take over. And then in the same time, there's a king in the south and he dies and another king takes over. And it follows in parallel until about the year 722, for about 200 years. And then the Assyrian Empire comes and destroys the northern kingdom, takes them captive, and that's it. And that's what we talk about 10 lost tribes. And then the entire focus of biblical history remains on Jerusalem and on the tribe of Yehuda, which is part of the reason we're called Jews, is because we come from the land of Judea when we were exiled. And that's where the focal point is. Now our focus in tonight and next week is in between those two events. About 100 years after the separation, about 100 years before the destruction. And our entire story takes place from the perspective of the northern kingdom, Yisrael. Now, where was the first capital of the United States?
Was it
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia?
Yeah, Philadelphia.
Right, and then it moved, right? The same thing happened, by the way, with us. Where was our first capital under David? Where did David establish his capital first?
Hebron.
Hebron. And then 7 years later, he moved it to Jerusalem. Well, the same thing happened in the north. In the north, the first kingdom was actually in Shechem. And then it moved to a town called Tirzah. And then it moved to a town called Shomron. And we're going to hear about how that happens right here. So we're going to pick up the story in the middle of chapter 16 of Kings 1, verse 23. Again, it's in translation here, but I can't show you both on the screen. I could, but then the print would be too small for all of us. So here's the background. In the 31st year of the king of Yehuda, Asa, Malach Omri al Yisrael. There's a fellow named Omri who takes over and becomes the head of a new dynasty. Important to note, Omri is a guy who never wanted to be king. He didn't try to be king. He didn't try to take over the kingdom. But his followers all wanted him to be king, so he took over. He was king for 12 years. Where in Tirzah, Malach Shanim. In a town called Tirzah, he established a new capital for 6 years. He was king for 12 years. So what about the other 6? There was a fellow named Shemer, and he bought a mountain that Shemer owned, and he bought it for 2 slabs of silver. And therefore, he built the mountain up, which may mean that he built an artificial mountain, but he also means he built buildings on the mountain. And in honor of the fellow he bought it from, he called it Shomron, because the guy's name was Shemer. That, by the way, is Shomron. And when we talk today about Yehuda v'Shomron, this is where it starts. This is where Shomron starts. Shomron, by the way, from this point on, becomes a nickname for the northern kingdom for now, till it's finished. Take a look as an example in Hosea chapter 14, verse 1, just as a quick example, Te'asham Shomron, another name for the northern kingdom. Now, this is an important point within all of the book of Kings, is that the kings are judged by 2 measures. They are judged first and foremost by their fealty to God and their loyalty to whatever prophet is operating at their time. But they're also judged by military, economic, and geopolitical success. And often the judgments are not consistent, meaning you could have a guy who religiously is a great guy, but he's a failure as a king, and you can have the opposite. Omri, we hear, does bad in God's eyes. He did worse than everybody before him. By the way, everybody in the northern kingdom is always worse than the guy before him. So figure out, it's a little bit of hyperbole. He followed the ways of that first king, Yeravam ben Nevat. In other words, he encouraged and he participated in idolatry. Idolatry is not a simple issue. It's very easy for us to take pot shots at it. Not so simple, and we're going to see that a little bit towards the end of tonight's shiur. Notice, Omri gets very little press. 12 years, 6 years here, 6 years there, bought a mountain. We don't like him very much. But on the other hand, which what it says. The rest of the things that he did, and all of his mighty deeds, open up the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel, which we don't have, by the way. But if you look at it, you'll find some great stories about Omri as a very powerful king. He's buried in Shomron, and who takes over for him? And this is the king who is the king of Eliyahu, meaning every famous prophet has a king he has to deal with. Moshe has Paro. Right? Think about that. Shmuel has Shaul and then David. But Yeshayahu has Chizkiyahu. Every one of the prophets has some political leader, might be Jewish, might be not Jewish, who has to deal with. Eliyahu's king is Achav. Right? And if you like Moby Dick, you'll love the name Achav. Achav, who is the son of Omri, takes over. Now, Achav is another character with a mixed review. The Achav ben Omri Malach Yisrael, in the meantime, in the south, Asa is ruling forever. So in his 38th year, Achav becomes king. But get this. He rules for 22 years. And at this point, you got to step back and ask, and this is vital for the whole book of Kings and for the story of Eliyahu. If the guy's so rotten, and he is, you're going to hear how terrible he is, why does God let him stay king for 22 years? 22 minutes should be enough. Unclear. And the reality is that when you read the story of Achav from the other perspective of economic success, military success, geopolitical standing, Achav is actually a very successful king. And by the way, he dies a hero's death. So we would like to do 2 thumbs down on Achav. Can't do that fairly.
Recording in progress.
But our perspective. Well, I'll have to mute everybody right now. From our perspective, from the religious perspective, Achav is a bad guy. And now let's hear about it. Achav did bad in God's eyes, worse than anybody before him. Of course, we've heard that before. But now we get the details. It wasn't enough for him to do what Yeravam did. He took as a wife a woman named Izebel, who goes down in history as the most evil woman in history. You want to talk about a bad woman, you say Jezebel. He takes a woman named Izebel, who is the daughter of a fellow named Etbaal, who is the king of Sidon. Sidon is the Phoenician kingdom in Lebanon. Now, what is Achav doing marrying this girl? Why does he marry this girl? And the simple explanation is just like Shlomo married the daughter of Paro. Marriages in those days were not done because of romance. They weren't done because of shared values. They were done because of political, military, and financial arrangements. Meaning, 2 tribes want to create a treaty. The best way to create a connection is one man from the tribe marries a daughter from the other tribe. 2 kingdoms want to create an alliance. The best way to do it is for the princess to marry the king of another country. And so, and we hear that Shlomo married princesses from all sorts of other kingdoms. It didn't turn out well. He takes Izebel because he wants to create a relationship with the northern kingdom of the Phoenicians. We have a long history with the Phoenicians. We have a long history with Sidon, because that was the kingdom that provided the wood for the Beit HaMikdash. That was where it was Tzor, but it's in the Phoenician kingdom. We have a relationship with them. Now, what is the name of the woman and the name of her father? These names are important. Izebel. So Izebel sounds like a terrible name, right? A woman of, whatever it is, Zebel being dung. But that's actually not what the name is. The word Baal, which is going to be prominent throughout tonight and next week, the word Baal, which means master, was the name of the gods of Canaan. And the Phoenicians also had such gods. And there were all sorts of Baalim, Baal Brit, and Baal Tzfon, and Baal Zvul, and all sorts of other Baal Hanan ben Achbor, all sorts of other gods. the Baalim were worshipped by this group. Her father's name is Etbaal, which means Ishbaal, a man of Baal. And her name is Izebel because the god that they worshiped was called Baal Zevul. Baal Zevul means the master of the high place. But Baal, again, is a god name. Baal Zevul becomes master of the high place. We use that word Zvul in Sur Mishalo. We talk about the Beit HaMikdash as Zvul Beit Tifartecha, based on a pasuk in Kings. The high place, your high glorious place. Their god is Baal Zevul, master of the high place. Important to note that Tanakh is on a relentless mission to criticize and make fun of idolatry. So what does the Bible call Baal Zvul? It calls it Baal Zevuv, not Lord of the high place, but Lord of the flies. That's where the famous book that so many people got tortured in high school comes from, Lord of the Flies, Baal Zevul, Zvuv. The Christians call it Beelzebub, but it's all Baal Zvul, and then we play with the word. But she's a high priestess or priestess of this cult, and Achav marries her. And now what happens? Vayelach vayavod et haBaal vayishtachu lo. And then Achav goes, and he himself worships Baal. And she probably wants him to. Vayakim mizbeach laBaal beit haBaal asher b'nasham b'shomron. So now watch what's happened. He builds a temple to Baal, and he sets up an altar for Baal in Shomron, in the capital. He also plants an Asherah. An Asherah is a tree that is planted next to Baal's altar. We read about it in Shoftim Perek Vav, that they would erect an altar made out of stone to Baal, and next to it plant a tree, and the tree was called Asherah. Asherah, by the way, is the girlfriend of Baal. So wherever you have a Baal Mizbeach, that's the guy. You have the girl, which is the tree next to it. That's why the Torah forbids us from planting a tree next to the Mizbeach that we build for God. So he's got a Baal Mizbeach, he's got a Baal house, he's got an Asherah, and he does all of these terrible things. Then we get one final note at the end of this chapter. B'yamav banach Yel Beita Eli et Yericho. In his day, a guy from the town of Beit El, a guy named Chiel, built up the city of Yericho. Now, what would be wrong with building Yericho, except that when Yericho was destroyed, remember the walls came tumbling down? Yehoshua uttered an imprecation, a curse, that nobody should ever build Yericho. And if they ever do build Yericho, they'll start building it and their oldest son will die. And by the time they finish building it, their youngest son will die. And that's exactly what happens. This guy, Chiel, builds the city, and his eldest son, Aviram, dies. As he said, lays the foundation. By the time he puts the doors up, his last son dies. Just like God said through Yoshua. Now that sets the stage, because now we've got the king of Israel who no longer, like his father and kings before him, may have quietly on their own worshiped Baal, but now he makes Baal state religion. And now suddenly the impact of Baal becomes much stronger. Now we have to talk about what this means, because to us, it's so foreign that it's very hard to grasp. What is idolatry? So we think of idolatry as you make a clay something and you look at it and you call it a god and you pray to it. It's much more sophisticated than that. People are not that simple, not that idiotic. In the world of paganism is many different worlds, but the part that impacts on us is a strong belief that different gods had power over different areas and different walks of life. There's a god of rain and a god of fertility, etc., which are related, and a god of sunshine, and there's also a god of war. And think about the Roman gods and the Greek gods. Also, there's a whole pantheon of gods, because each one of them has a different thing that they're in charge of or that they get to run. Now, the other piece of the puzzle is, as I said, that the belief was that gods have control over regions. So for instance, when Moshe comes to Paro and says, Hashem has sent me, Paro's answer is, I don't know who this God is. Basically, I don't know, he might be a God, but he's a God of the desert. He's not a God here. Here we've got our own gods. And that's why God says, I am going to do plagues against the Egyptians in Egypt, and you'll know that I'm God in Egypt. because that's the battle. There is no regional God. There's one God who controls everything. Now, it takes a long time to wean people off of simplistic and immature beliefs. It takes them generations. And therefore, at the very beginning, Am Yisrael still is wedded to the idea of a bunch of local gods and symbols, etc. Takes time to move away from it. We're in the land. We have not extirpated the local inhabitants, so there's that influence. We get very frightened because it doesn't rain for a while. And we're praying to Hashem, but it's not raining. So instead of saying we have to improve our own moral standing and our own religious commitment to God so that God will favor us with rain, instead, you know what? I like God, but just in case, I better pray to Baal too. So make sure it rains. And so what people got involved with at this time was what we refer to as syncretism, meaning they believe in Hashem, but also Baal and all the Baalim. And just to make sure, they worship the Baalim. They worship God too, but they also worship the Baalim just to make sure. And that will set the scene here. Okay, now enter the stage. And it is a most dramatic and bizarre entrance for our hero. We just met Achav. We heard that Achav is a bad guy. By the way, we also hear that Achav built a lot of big things. The two most famous builders in the history of the land of Israel are Achav and Herod, two guys that we're not thrilled with, but we have to admit were magnificent builders who did a lot in that realm. Here we go. Vayomer Eliyahu HaTishbi mitoshavei Gilead el Achav. When we go to the song that you mentioned, and you got already 2 out of the 3 descriptors of Eliyahu. Eliyahu HaNavi. What's the next part of the line? Eliyahu HaNavi. Somebody tell me?
Tishbi,
And then Eliyahu
Giladi.
HaGiladi. So let's find out what that means. Eliyahu HaTishbi mitoshavei Gilead. Now there's a little play on words. Eliyahu is a fellow who comes from the town called Toshev. Toshev is a town in the hills of Jordan, just over the Jordan River, approximately 10 miles south of the Kinneret. Those mountains are called the Gilead Mountains. Those are the mountains which we're going to read about next week in the Parsha, where Yaakov and Lavan had their famous détente and set up the thing and separated. That's the Gilead Mountains. Eliyahu comes from a town in the Gilead, and the town is called Toshev. By the way, in the town of Toshev today, in Jordan, there is a monastery called Mar Elias, Master Eliyahu, because that's where he comes from. Now, he's mitoshavei Gilead, meaning he lives in the area of Gilead, which means he's probably from what tribe? Remember, this is the east side of the Jordan. So what tribe is this? This is before any of the tribes have been dispersed or exiled.
God.
So he's probably from God, exactly. Now there are midrashim that he's from Levi, and there's midrashim that he's from Binyamin. But the simple reading of it is that he's from Shevet God, right? And he comes from the Gilad, and that's why we call him Eliyahu HaTishbi, Eliyahu Giladi. Okay. And that's all we're told. We're not given any background. Eliyahu HaTishbi of Gilad says to Achav, Chai Adonai Elohei Yisrael Asher Amadti Lefanav. I swear by the name of God, God lives, that I've stood in front of, meaning Nivuah, so is Eliyahu HaNavi. Im hiyeh hashanim ha'ele tal umatar, ki'im lefi dvarim. That there will not be any rain or dew these years unless I say so. I say so means I say so. Eliyahu. Eliyahu does not say that this is what God said. Eliyahu says, I'm swearing by God in front of whom I've stood that unless I say so, there won't be any rain. And he stops the rain. A little bit of John Fogerty here. Who will stop the rain? So this, as you will see, is a little bit of a disturbing statement. And we're going to see it corrected as Eliyahu himself goes through a long educational process. So let's let it play out. Okay, so now we'll read through the story. Then God tells him, he declared the drought. I live in California, so drought's a harsh word for us. But he declared the drought. And then God says to him, Lech mizeh ufanita l'cha kedma. go from here, go east from here, because Eliyahu had crossed the river. He'd come into Shomron, and he had announced to Achav. Chazal actually say he went to Yericho to pay a shiva call at that fellow's house whose sons had all died. But he'd come on the east side, on the west side, and God says, go east, v'nistarta b'nachal Krit. I want you to go into a wadi. A wadi is a riverbed, and the name of the riverbed is Nachal Krit, Asher al Pnei Yarden. It's right east of the Jordan. Al Pnei is east of the Jordan. Go to Nachal Krit. You will get water from that Nachal. And I've commanded the ravens to bring you food. So what's going to happen? He goes and does what God says. He goes. He gets bread and meat in the morning, bread and meat in the evening. By the way, does this sound familiar to you? Getting bread and meat in the morning and in the evening. Does it sound a little bit like the story of the man? Right? So it's like Eliyahu has been transported back to a pre-Eretz Yisrael desert kind of experience where God is feeding him. It's very nice. His water comes from the Nachal. The problem is there's a drought. So after a while, the riverbed dried out. There's no rain. Before we move ahead, does this story remind you of a later story in Jewish literature about a man who is in disfavor with the authorities, and he runs away and miraculously is fed until he leaves? Is anybody familiar with the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? So according to the story, the way the Gemara tells it, Masachet Shabbat, Shimon Bar Yochai had spoken up against the Romans. The Romans got very angry, put out a hit on him. And what did he do? He ran away. First, he ran to the Beit Midrash, and then he ran to a cave. And he goes into the cave, he and his son, and miraculously, a carob tree grows right in front of the cave, so they have carobs to eat, and a spring appears, and they have water to drink. And they stay there for 12 years, and then the 13th year. And that story is clearly built on this story. Okay. So he ran out of water, though. Now watch the next step. God says to him, now, by the way, notice what's happening. The people are dying. There is a drought. And who declared the drought? Eliyahu. And God doesn't tell him, Eliyahu, time to lift it. And God also doesn't say, I don't care what you said, I'm going to make it rain. God goes along with what Eliyahu did and doesn't push him. On the other hand, God's taking care of Eliyahu, shows him where to get water, and when that runs out, he sends him somewhere else. Now watch where he sends him. It's remarkable. Kumlech Sarfata Asher Sidon. Now, there's a town called Sarfat. When you say Sarfat, does anybody know what Sarfat is in modern Hebrew? It's not just modern, it's medieval Hebrew.
France.
France. But Sarfat is not France. Sarfat and Sfarad, which is what we call Spain, are both in the second to last pasuk of the book of Avadia. And they don't mean France and Spain. They refer to two towns in Lebanon. But for whatever reasons, phonetically, those names stuck to those countries. But he tells them to go to Tzarfat, which is part of Sidon. Do you understand what's happening? He's going from the fire into the frying pan into the fire. He's now experiencing the drought because now his water ran out at his source. And Hashem says to him, now I want you to go to Sidon, which is, by the way, the kingdom that provided the princess that corrupted the king, which is why there's a whole drought to start with. Okay. You stay there. I have directed a widow there who's going to feed you. Now, interesting, as you'll find, this widow does not know anything. God didn't tell her, listen, feed him. But realize that the widow here is treated like the ravens were before. God commanded the ravens to feed him. Now God has commanded the widow to feed him. Very strange story. I want you to put into mind, and we're going to come back to this at the end of this chapter. Do you know another story where God keeps sending agents out to move the story along? And God says, and the text says, God has an agent, he sends the agent to do this. The agents are not people. All right, keep it in mind. We'll come back to it, you'll see. Because its story is very much tied in with his story. Okay. So Vayakum Vayelech Tzarfat. He goes to Tzarfat, Vayavo Petach Ha'ir, he comes to the front of the city, the gate of the city. V'yesham Isha Almana Koshesh Teitzim. He sees a widow, evidently an older woman, seems out on her own, so that means she doesn't have a husband perhaps, is gathering wood. He calls her and says, please let me have some water. It sounds like last week's parsha. He's a guy traveling and he comes and he sees a woman. Now it's not a young, pretty, unmarried woman. It's an older widow. And he says, let me have some water. She gives it to him. And then he goes on. Now he doesn't say, give my camels water. He doesn't have water for the camels. Can I have a little bit of the bread that you have? He's a wayfarer. Batomer, and she says, Chai Adonai Elohecha. Now notice, she says, by the life of God. Did we hear that phrase earlier? We did in the first pasuk when Eliyahu took an oath by the life of God that there will be no rain. What does she say by the life of God? Im yeshli ma'og, if I even have some cake here, ki melochaf kemach bakad. All I have is one spoonful of flour in the pot, in the canister, and a little bit of oil. I'm gathering 2 pieces of wood to make a little fire. And I'm going to make this little flour and this little oil together and make a little bit of bread. And we'll eat it and we'll die. There's no welfare. There's no food stamps. There's no Tomchei Shabbos. This woman's about to die. She's got no food. There's a drought, so everything is in crisis mode. The drought is even affecting them up there. They haven't yet figured out how to do desalinization, so they can't use the ocean water. She says, this is it. We're going to eat a little bit and die. Eliyahu says, not to worry. Do what you said. You're going to make a little bread. First, make me a tiny little kochala. I always picture Eliyahu speaking Yiddish. And you'll get out of that enough for me and you and for your son. Then you make it for your son afterwards. Meaning, first make me something, then make it for them. Now, that seems like an extremely chutzpahdik request. This woman's saying, this is my last bit of flour and oil. We're going to eat it and we're going to die. And he says, don't worry about it, but first give me something. Then you can feed yourself. So he goes on. He quotes God. And what does God say? Very strange, because God, we didn't hear God say this. This became a very popular song in Israel many years ago. The canister of flour will not give out, meaning will not be finished, and the canister of oil will never be lacking. Now we hear Eliyahu a little bit moving forward, and I'll explain what I mean. Until the day that God makes it rain. Because if you think about it, at the beginning of the chapter, what did Eliyahu say? There will be no rain unless I say so. He's presenting himself as in charge. By the time we get here, he maybe has been humbled and learned a lesson, which is, it's not up to me, it's up to God. Perhaps. At least from his words, it sounds like that. And he says, until God makes it rain, meaning until the drought is over, you will always have enough flour and oil. Now, somehow, she believes him. There must be something about Eliyahu that's impressive, that's powerful, that makes her believe. And what does she do? She goes and does exactly what he said. And for a year, she and her whole household had food. Beautiful. And the oil didn't give out, the flour didn't give out, just like God said. Beautiful. Okay. So we got what we call in Hebrew a happy end. Right? Great. Except not. After this happened, remember she had a son? That son got very sick. He stopped breathing. She says to Eliyahu, she turns to Eliyahu. Now, Eliyahu's been there for a year, and she's had nonstop food, flour and oil for a year. And she turns to Eliyahu after all this and says, Mali valachi shalim. Well, what are you doing here, you man of God? She calls him a man of God, but she's angry he came. Why? You came here to demonstrate my sin and to kill my son. What does she mean by that? She means, look, till now we weren't on anybody's radar. But now suddenly we're on God's radar. And so if I have any faults, then he's gonna punish me. And so he's killed my son. And she said, you put the spotlight on me. Why did you do this? But notice, she recognized him as Ish Elohim. So he says, give me your son. He takes him up to a loft. We now find out that she has a loft, and he's living in the loft, and he's got his own place. He makes him lie down, lies him down on his bed. He calls out to God, and what does he say? Adonai Elohai. He prays to God. Now, this is the first time we've heard him doing this. What, you're also going to do evil to this almanah that I'm living with? Now, what's behind this prayer? What's behind, because it's not a prayer, it's a complaint. He's saying, understand, you're also doing evil to this almanah that I'm living with? Also meaning what? Besides everybody else who's had the drought? But by the way, who called the drought, Eliyahu? You did. So it's a very strange claim. But Eliyahu seems to be doing a little bit of what we refer to in Holocaust education. One of the biggest challenges in Holocaust education is the number. You can't teach 6 million. It's just too mind-boggling. I try to tell my kids, fill up a football stadium 120 times, and now you've got that. It's too big to think about. So what do we do? What do they do at the Holocaust museums? They tell the story of one person. And you get very involved in the story of one person, and then you magnify it out. Yafa Eliyahu HaNavi wrote a thick book about one town, Aishisha. You get to know a town, you get to love the people in town, you get to care about, identify with them, and then you find out they're wiped out. That makes a much bigger impact than numbers. Here, Eliyahu declared a drought. There are people dying left and right, people suffering terribly. But now there's this woman who's taking care of him. He feels connected, he feels an identification, he feels sympathy. And now her son is dying or has died, and Eliyahu now has a complaint. So watch what happens. God doesn't turn to him and say, Eliyahu, it wasn't my idea to have a drought. You called the drought, so I had to send you somewhere. Instead, he lies on the kid, or he lines up with the kid 3 times. He calls out to God again. Please bring his life back. What does he do? Is it CPR? Is it really resurrection? Unclear. God listens to Eliyahu. Now, interesting, here it says God listened to Eliyahu. Right? Eliyahu made a demand, God gave into the demand. It doesn't say before that when Eliyahu said, there'll be no rain for 3 years, that God listened to him. Because notice, Eliyahu didn't pray about that. Eliyahu just declared a famine. And that's what happened. And what happens? And the kid comes back to life. And Eliyahu brings the kid downstairs. Gives him to the mother. See, your son's alive. Now notice what she says. Now I know that you're a man of God. What do you mean, now I know? She's had nonstop flour and oil with no source for a year. So what does it mean, now I know you're a man of God? Because remember, up until now, Eliyahu has been presenting things on his own terms. The famine, he doesn't quote God at all. And then he says God's going to make sure that there's no lack of flour and oil, but we never heard God say that. Eliyahu is pulling the strings here. So he might be a powerful man, he might be a charismatic, he might know how to pull certain powers, but he's not yet an Ish Elohim. When does he become an Ish Elohim? When he prays to God and he accepts that it's up to God, life and death, and God says, okay, and he brings him back to life. And then she says, now I know you're an Ish Elohim. Now I know that the things you're saying are true. Which, by the way, is interesting, because how does she explain the flour and the oil? So she could explain it. Remember, people are still in that Balmud. She could think he was somebody who knew how to pull magics, etc. But now she sees this in Ish Elohim. All right, before moving on from the Torah.
What was he doing there? Why did he go there?
Why did he go there? Because God told him to go there.
Okay, good enough.
And yeah, it does work. But remember, God told him to go there after the water ran out. And there are two things, and then you're going to see a third. The first, on a simple level, is you ran out of water. I'm going to send you somewhere where you can help somebody and they'll help you. You're going to help this woman out, but in the meantime, she's going to help you because she's going to take care of you. And you got to find a place which is totally off the radar. You're right, really in the belly of the beast. Nobody's going to look for you there, and you'll be taken care of. On a whole other level, Eliyahu is being sent there not only to save this woman and maybe to save her child. We'll talk about that in a second, but also maybe to learn a lesson and maybe to see the impact of his declaration of a drought up close and see how it really impacts on people. And you're going to see that Eliyahu's education accelerates over time. We move from there'll be no rain unless I say so to until God makes it rain. But still, it's Eliyahu's own words until he actually prays for the kid.
Is it possible that this woman didn't believe in God until this happened? Because she refers to him as Hashem Elokecha in the beginning.
Right. Interesting question. So we'd have to put that, I'm going to reframe the question because there really was no notion of atheism in the world of Tanakh. There was a notion of polytheism. There was a notion of dualism. There's a lot of different, and nobody that we hear of in the Tanakh. In that time there were, but in the Tanakh, we don't really hear about people denying the existence of a superior being. Might be a lot of superior beings, might my superior, your superior being, a lot of superior beings, but not none. But you're right, it does sound like she's saying, look, I worship other gods, but it's your God, so, except that in Tanakh, it's actually not used that way. I'll give you an example. In this week's Parsha, something for the table. In this week's Parsha, when Yaakov dresses up like Esav, and he comes to his blind father, pretending to be Esav, and his father, the first thing he says, how did you get here so quick? And what does Yaakov say? Ki yikra Adonai Elohecha lefanai. Hashem, your God, came before me. By the way, that's not the only case. You find that in the Nevi'im. When Shaul talks to Shmuel, he says Hashem Elohecha. Now, of course, we all say Hashem Elokeinu. But in Tanakh, when you're talking to the superior, to the prophet, to the leader, often that's the phrase that's used, Hashem Elokecha, right? And so here, that may be what's going on. It may be what you're saying, that till now she was somebody of undistinguished beliefs, and she may have been a Baalist like a lot of people, and you've got Hashem, that's your God, I got a bunch of others, could be. Chazal have an interesting observation. Before leaving this parak, Chazal have a very interesting observation about this kid. Now, by the way, what's this woman's name? You're right, we don't know. What's the kid's name? You're right, we don't know. What tribe is she from? Got no clue. The only thing that I would suggest is maybe she's from the tribe of Asher, because Asher lives up in that area. So she might be from Asher. Chazal make an extravagant suggestion, and they say the name of this child who he saved is Yonah ben Amittai. Wow, where'd they get that from? So the first problem they have is that Yonah ben Amittai, who we meet once in the book of Malachim, Yonah, the boat Yonah. Yonah ben Amittai, who we meet in Malachim Bet Perak Yudalid, is from Gat HaChefer. Gat HaChefer is a town of Zvulun. That's right in the heartland of the country. So what's he doing way up there? So they actually respond to that. And they say his father was from Zvulun, his mother was from Asher, and when his father died, his mother went back to the Alterheim, back to her known territory, and was raising him there. It's a little far-fetched. Where's this coming from? So I'll tell you where it's coming from. I asked you before, you noticed here, God commands the ravens and God commands the almanan. God's got all sorts of agents to move the story along. And I asked you if that reminded you of a story. So I want to remind you, Yonah gets thrown off the boat, and what happens? He's thrown off the boat, he's drowning. What happens?
The Dagah.
Right. And Vayiman Hashem Elokim Dagah. God appoints a fish to eat him up. At the end of that chapter, chapter 2, after he's prayed and said his Shirah, God commands the Dagah, and the Dagah spits him out. Okay, he goes to Nineveh, and he gives his speech, and the people do tshuva, a famous thing, and no about it, right, which is his own story. And then Yonah moves east of the city, to look and see what's going to happen. Are people going to be destroyed, not be destroyed? Is their tshuva going to stick, not stick? Unclear what he's waiting for. He's sitting there, and it's hot. And what does God do? God appoints a tree, and the tree grows over. And Yonah is very happy. And the next thing is God appoints a worm that goes into the tree, eats up the tree, and the next day all the leaves die and the tree's dead. And then God appoints a chamsin, a blistering hot wind. And Yonah is again very depressed. And the whole story is a story about God continuing to send agents to get Yonah and give him the message. Yonah and Eliyahu are two sides of the same coin. And that's why Chazal tie them together here in this story. Why are they two sides of the same coin? So the Mechilta makes the observation that there was one prophet who was very concerned about the honor of the Jewish people, but wasn't overly concerned with the honor of God. And there was another prophet who was extremely concerned with the honor of God, but wasn't so concerned with the honor of the Jewish people, which means that each one of them missed something vital. Who was the prophet who was concerned with the honor of the Jewish people, but not of God? Yonah. Because the famous argument goes, why didn't Yonah want to go to Nineveh and correct the people? Because he knew that they would accept it and they'd do tshuva, and it would make the Jewish people look bad. Therefore, he didn't want to make the Jewish people look bad. He refused, and he even risked his life to refuse. Very nice, but wrong. Eliyahu, in the meantime, as we will see, probably next week, Eliyahu comes to God and complains and says, your children have abandoned you and they all want to kill me and I'm the only loyal person left. He's very zealous for honor for God, but not so zealous to honor his people. Who is the Navi who puts them together? Who is absolutely zealous for God's honor, but is obsessed with protecting the people? None other than Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the one who stands at the pinnacle of the prophet. So you understand here that these associations with Yonah are not just a convenient thing of we don't know where Yonah comes from, and here we've got this orphan kid who put them together, but really because the two stories are sort of like opposite sides of a coin or two sides of a mirror. Okay, this is where the story goes, and the story moves on, and we're going to start the next chapter, which is really the biggest chapter in the Eliyahu story and the most dramatic one. We're going to start it. And we'll pick up next week right at this point. And next week, we're going to cover a lot more ground because a lot less background. The third year, we assume the third year of the drought. I can tell you, as somebody who lives in California, 3 years of drought is pretty terrible. Right? Because 3 years of drought also means not just no water. What else does it mean? It means nothing's growing. It means the animals have nothing to graze on. It means animals are dying. It's just one thing piling off the other. Look what God says. Go appear before Achab and tell him, I'm going to make it rain. Notice, I'm going to make it rain, not you. All right? Eliyahu by now has to some extent moved ahead in his education and understanding his role in things. He's an agent, not the guy in charge. So he goes to find Achab. In the meantime, the famine is very heavy in Shomron. Now, again, Achab, from our perspective, terrible guy, Russia, awful. But watch what the text says about him. There was a houseman, maybe chief of staff of Achab's palace, named Obadiah. Obadiah, by the way, is Hebrew for Abdallah, right? Worship, servant of God. Obadiah, he was very fearful of God. And parenthetically, Izebel cut off or killed all of the prophets of Hashem because they were opposed to her Baal worship that she introduced. And she was the queen, so she ordered their death. She's going to order more deaths. We'll hear about that. Notice how beautiful a parallel this is. Obadiah takes 100 of the prophets of God and he hides them in 2 caves, 50 in each cave, and he feeds them bread and water. In other words, Obadiah is the new raven. Obadiah is the new raven. He's taking care of these guys. Good guy. We like him. Back to present time. Achab says to Obadiah, go look for all the springs, meaning there were springs, and all of the riverbeds, Maybe we'll find some grass there. We can keep our horses and mules alive. We won't be totally finished with our animals. All right. So Achav, by the way, now he's putting on his jeans, taking a hike. He's not sitting on his throne. They split up the land. They each went their separate ways. So Avadiah is alone. And now this will tell you something about Eliyahu's reputation. Avadiah was on the road. And there's Eliyahu. Oh, by the way, Eliyahu, everybody recognizes him. His face is on every milk carton. Everybody knows what Eliyahu looks like. Right? What's the first thing Obadiah does? He falls on his face. He prostrates himself before Eliyahu. Vayomer ha'atah Eliyahu, are you really my master Eliyahu? Yeah, that's me. Go tell Achav that I'm here. Now, Obadiah's response is really funny. Obadiah prostrates himself before Eliyahu, accepts Eliyahu as his master. When Eliyahu says, go tell your boss that I'm here, watch what he says. Vayomer mechatati. What did I do wrong? Why are you giving me this job? You're going to have Achav kill me. Why? What's his reason? So notice the reputation Eliyahu has. Again, an oath in God's name. Achav looked for you everywhere. And everybody said, we don't know where you are. In other words, he's looked everywhere for you. He scoured the world because he wants to kill you. And nobody could find you. So evidently, Achav had either good relations or powerful relations with other nations nearby, and he made them take oaths that they haven't found you. Now you're saying, now you're saying, go tell Achav that I'm here. So what? You should be happy. Not so quick. I'm going to leave you. You're going to suddenly, the wind of God is going to take you somewhere where nobody knows where you are. You're a man of flight. You're the mystery man. Claude Range. You're here today, invisible tomorrow. So I'm going to go tell Achav you're here. He's going to come. You won't be there, and he'll kill me. And you know that I fear God. And then he tells the story about how he has saved these prophets. Again, an oath in God's name. I promise I'll be there. I swear I'll be there. And so Eliyahu, with that oath in hand, goes and tells Achav, I found Eliyahu. I didn't find grass. I didn't find water. I found Eliyahu. By the way, which is good because I found the source of the problem. Now is the grand meeting that we haven't yet seen between king and prophet. King, powerful king, popular king, but right now, king over a devastated kingdom of 3 years of drought, and the prophet who's responsible for the drought. When Achav saw Eliyahu, Achav looks at him and says, oh, here's the guy who's hurting the Jewish people. Here's the devil of the Jewish people. I'm not the one who served Am Yisrael. It's you and your family. You left God's commandments and you're following Baalim. In other words, what we got set up here, and this is what we're going to break, what we got set up here is that Achav looks at Eliyahu in a purely functional manner. You're the guy who called for the drought. Eliyahu looks at Achav in a foundational manner. The reason for all of this happening is because of what you've done as a leader to introduce and mandate state worship of Baal, of the Baalim. What we're going to do next week in the beginning of this year is we're going to look at this famous stand, and explore a little bit about Baal worship because it's a piece of this puzzle. What we've seen over the course of the last 59 minutes is I gave an introduction to the time period, an introduction to the political reality of the Northern Kingdom, an introduction to Omri and then Achav. We find out where Achav is, Achav's wife, and Achav's father-in-law, the connection with Baal worship and the Phoenicians. And then we got introduced to Eliyahu. And we noted that Eliyahu comes on the scene dramatically without an introduction. We found out what Tishbi is, what Gilead is, Eliyahu HaNavi, but notice at the beginning, Eliyahu makes declarations on his own. And then God slowly educates him by showing a place where he can be totally away from everybody. He's back in the desert. He's getting fed in the morning and in the evening from heaven, just like the man, but that means he's not in the land. He's away from everybody. And that didn't work. So now Eliyahu has to go be in the midst of people and live with somebody who's suffering. And it gets to the pinnacle where her son dies, which, by the way, was going to happen a year earlier without the food. So great, you brought me food. Now a year later, the son dies from something else. And now God finally steps in and directs Eliyahu into direction. And notice how parallel that is to the Yonah story. Yonah first, God says go, and Yonah says no, and Yonah goes in the other direction. And God doesn't talk to him. God doesn't say, come on, get back. God sends this agent, and God sends that agent, and God sends a storm, and God sends the lottery, and God sends the sailors, and then God sends the fish. And when Yonah is good and ready, God says, go to Nineveh again. And that's what happens here. After 3 years, Eliyahu is ready to go meet Achav and to talk to him, and to not talk to him, but stand off against him, and hopefully begin the process of correcting the path and straightening the rudder, righting the rudder of Am Yisrael's ship in its religious connection to God. Okay, any questions?
I have a quick question. So the resurrection story seems like it happens a lot in Malachim, with Elisha right afterwards in the Haftorah that we just read a couple of weeks ago.
It happens once with Elisha too.
Would you say that there's a stylistic difference because of the difference in personalities between the two prophets?
Yes, in several ways there are differences. However, one of the things that is parallel is that Elisha also has to go through an educational process to fully embrace the idea that this is fully God's doing. Because if you remember at the beginning, what does Elisha do to try to save the kid? He sends a stick and tells Gehazi, put the stick on the kid, right? And then finally he has to go himself and he has to pray directly to Hashem. So there seems to be something of a parallel educational process going on. But yes, Elisha's interaction is very different. By the way, Elisha is almost the opposite of Eliyahu in one critical way. Eliyahu is, like Obadiah describes, somebody who's here and flies away and we don't know where he is, man of mystery. Elisha lives with people. Elisha lives with this Shunamite family for a while and we know where he is on Har Carmel. You can always find Elisha, right? What does the Shunamite's husband say to her? Why are you going today? It's not Chodesh and not Shabbat, which means every Chodesh and every Shabbat she goes to see the Yishalim because we know where he is. He's like a regular, like a Rebbe. He's available. And Eliyahu is more like, man of mystery, right? In neither case, by the way, do we hear of them having families? Okay.
Any sorry, Rabbi Etshalom, any connection between the Mikoshesh Eitzim and Bamidbar and
I was thinking
the woman?
about that. I don't know. That's something to think about, whether or not the woman saying that I'm Mikoshesh Eitzim and then I'm going to die is a play on the fact that the Mikoshesh Eitzim is then killed. I don't know.
I was starting to develop some sympathy for the Mikoshesh Eitzim in Bamidbar. Maybe he was also in dire straits. I never thought about that.
Yeah. So I think that story, the Mikoshesh Eitzim, just as an aside, I think that the Mikoshesh Eitzim is a story that happened the second Shabbat of the Man. Right.
So he was already warned.
He was one of the guys who was it says people went out to collect man and they didn't find it. What we never hear what happens to them. All we hear is the guy gets angry. We don't hear what happens to them. I think he's one of the guys. But that's just yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, did the rabbis see this Jonah, this boy, as more of a successor to Elisha? And if so, well, what's that about?
Yeah, I don't think he's seen as a successor to anybody. And it's interesting that the historic Yonah of Sefer Malachim is placed in a very clear time frame, a very clear location, a relationship to Yoravam ben Yoash, which puts him at about the year 760 BCE, and that the Yonah of Sefer Yonah is sort of like out there. And even the fact that he goes to Nineveh is extremely weird, considering Nineveh is the capital of the empire that's about to destroy us. So Yonah, as the historic person, is kind of like a Sham, somewhere there, and not connected to anybody else. Elisha is very clearly connected to Eliyahu. He's his apprentice. He takes over, and we're going to meet him next week.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you, Rabbi Etshalom. Rabbi Etshalom had to pull himself away from the major basketball game there at the high school, so we appreciate it. We hope they won.
For those of you who know, it's the Globerman tournament. Our very dear friend Steve Globerman passed away at a very young age a few years ago. So we have a major basketball tournament in his memory every year. And so that's why I'm broadcasting actually from the school here at night instead of at home, because I got to get back to the game. But it was a pleasure learning with you. And next week we'll continue with the story of Eliyahu.
You had a few expats from Los Angeles tonight, the Segura and Evanderwald.
Okay, very good. Hello. Hi.
Evanderwald is really Gerber.
I'm not
Thank you
going
very
to say
much.
who I'm rooting for. I always get nailed on that one. So
Is that conference room in the front on Pico?
where I am?
Where you're
Oh,
sitting?
I'm at Shalhevet. I'm at
Oh,
tournaments at Shalhevet. It's yeah.
different school.
Yeah, I work at both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, who is it? Which Segura is that?
Josh.
Josh, hi, how are you doing? Good to see you. Okay. Anyways, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you
Okay.
next week.
We'll see you next week. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
well,
Thanks
good.
everyone for joining us. Join us
Thank
next week.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, everybody.